Today I'm going to be talking about the best value purchase you can make in the world of whiskey: glassware. So I'm going to be running through these roughly in reverse order from worst to best, and the first glass on our list takes me back several years to a time before COVID, when we were allowed to go to pubs without fear of catching anything. And it was a night where I went to one of my local pubs and I actually ordered a Johnnie Walker Green Label, and I sat outside because they had a nice little beer garden area, and it's quite dark, it's quite late at night, and I was drinking my Johnnie Walker, and I got this strong taste of aniseed. Now, aniseed is not something that I've ever really noticed, not to any great extent, in any Johnnie Walker whiskey, and I tried a little bit more and I think, yes, got this really strong aniseed flavour. I thought, I can't believe I haven't picked up on this before. So I get my tasting notes and I start making changes to them, adding in that there's this really strong flavour of aniseed, and I start thinking that actually it's more aniseed than I've ever tasted in any whiskey. It's almost like a Pernod. And I look down at my glass and there's a green crusted scum around the edge of this little lowball glass that the pub has given me, where the previous person has had their Pernod and lemonade, and they've given me a dirty glass and I've been drinking through someone else's Pernod scum for the last 5 minutes. So obviously I went back to the bar, returned the drink, told them what had happened, and never went back. But the first glass on our list, the worst glass that you can have, is a dirty glass. It doesn't matter what shape or size your glass is, if your glass is dirty, then it's the worst glass that you can possibly have. And it's not just something that can happen in dodgy pubs, it's something you have to be aware of at home as well. Because if you have a whiskey and you're doing a little bit of a comparison at home, and you pour a whiskey and you nose it and taste it and make your notes, and then the glass looks roughly empty, you pour another whiskey in there, you can't be sure that you haven't contaminated that second whiskey, and you can't completely be sure that what you're picking up on that second whiskey is actually from the whiskey itself. So my first recommendation in whiskey glasses is to buy enough that you can do a fairly large comparison with however many people you're likely to have around doing a comparison at any one time, and you can have a fresh glass for each whiskey, so you don't have to rely on being able to rinse the flavours out of the glass before the next one. If you do run out of glasses, then by all means give it a rinse out with some water, but you'll probably find that with some whiskies, especially heavily peated whiskey, water is not always going to be enough to get rid of those flavours. So first proper glass on our list of horrible glasses, the eponymous pint glass. So this is the sort of thing that you're going to get if you go into the average pub in England at least, and you ask for a whiskey. If you are unlucky enough to be somewhere that has absolutely no knowledge or interest of whiskey at all, you probably won't be unlucky enough to get something as ridiculous as this. But I have known pubs to give you a whiskey, if they're really not a whiskey pub, in something like this, in a half pint glass, or possibly a highball glass, something like that, something with straight sides that's just far too big to be any use as a whiskey glass. So let's take my pre-prepared whiskey here. This is actually a Tamnavulin. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to put that one aside, and I'm going to pour another Tamnavulin. So, keeping with the theme of buying a whiskey in a pub, got my shot measure here. I'm going to pour a single whiskey in here. So that is exactly 25 millilitres of whiskey. So in probably the majority of UK pubs these days, you generally either get a 25ml or a 35ml measure if you buy a single whiskey. And I would say that more often than not now you're looking at the slightly thriftier 25ml measures. So this is our single measure of whiskey, poured into my stemmed glassware here, the usual stuff that I normally use. That is what a single measure of whiskey looks like in a reasonable whiskey glass. A lot of people are often surprised at that when you're using proper whiskey glasses, a single measure actually looks like quite a lot. And that's one of the really good things about using small whiskey glasses, that it helps you to moderate a little bit more. Because if you're using a large tumbler, you have to pour quite a lot of whiskey in the bottom before it looks like you've really got any. And if you pour it by eye, you can quite often find that you end up drinking quite a lot more than you're aware of. Whereas a smaller glass, you can get a reasonable amount of whiskey in there. It looks like a fair amount without overdoing it. So let's tip our single measure of Tanmavulin Scotch into the half-pint glass. So now, exactly what I was talking about, that looks like a half-finished drink, even though it's a full single measure. And whereas with the smaller whiskey glass, you can really get the sense of the aroma. With this one, I would say that the main aroma that I'm getting from this is probably freshly washed glass. Just that slightly stale water smell that you get in a glass that's been recently washed up. To be honest, I didn't wash this half-pint glass particularly thoroughly because I wasn't intending to use it for critical whiskey tasting, but you can probably smell more of my dishcloth than you can of the actual whiskey in here. Because the problem with getting a pint glass or a half-pint glass or even a highball, the whiskey is so far down inside the glass that aroma has to work so hard to get to the top of the glass before you can actually smell anything. I know a lot of people will be saying, I buy whiskey to drink it, not to smell it, but you have to remember that even when you taste something, over half of the experience that you get, those flavours that you think you're tasting, are actually coming from your nose, your sense of smell, because your sense of smell constantly works in tandem with your tongue, and that's how you build up a picture of how something tastes when you're eating or drinking it. And if you don't believe me, just hold your nose and try some of your favourite whiskey and just see the huge difference it makes not being able to use your nose when you drink your whiskey. So that's a 25ml measure in a large pint or half pint glass, so we're only getting half the experience basically because it's so far down in the bottom that we're just unable to smell it. So let's move on. So we've had enough of our local pub because they don't give a crap about whiskey and they're not giving us the glassware that we need. What if we go to our trendy wine bar or nightclub and we ask for a single measure of Scotch whisky there? It's probably not something that many of us do, something that I definitely don't do very often, but something that you might get if you ask for a whisky in your average nightclub. It's a shot glass. So shot glass it seems like a much more sensible size for a shot of whisky, doesn't it? Clue is in the name. Let's see if I can pour this into there without making a mess. So ignoring the losses that we made by pouring there, you can see that this shot glass is actually designed more for probably a 50mm, so like the smaller of the two measures that you can get if you ask for a double. But you can see that that's a much more sensible size glass for whiskey. So let's see what happens when we nose it. So I am getting a lot more of the flavour through from the whiskey from this glass, purely because the whiskey is that much closer to my nose. So the whiskey is, all of those aromatic compounds are evaporating off the whiskey, but because the sides of the glass are straight, all of that aroma is evaporating straight up and it's just dispersing into the room. It's not being directed to my nose. It's very difficult without putting my nose directly into the glass to actually get any aroma. So probably better than the highball, but still not great. So the shot glass, obviously we're all aware that a shot glass it's probably fair to say it's for people who don't want to taste their spirits. It's for someone that wants a glass that does the bare minimum in terms of being a glass, and that's to hold the liquid, probably filled either right up to the edge or nearly up to the edge, and just to hold it safely before they sling it down their throat and probably drink it all in one gulp, whilst trying not to have any experience in terms of taste or aroma at all. Another thing that I've got to mention that really annoys me, whenever you see people taking a shot in a film or on TV, you always see them sling it back, they gulp it in one, and then they go, ah, and then they slam the glass down on the table. That really annoys me, because you just know, half the time you can see that it's either Jack Daniels or vodka or tequila that they're drinking. You know that it's bottled at 40% strength, and you just think, what sort of drinker are you that you drink something at 40% and you have to pretend that it burns like battery acid after you've drunk it? That's just something that's always really annoyed me, possibly almost as much as people that drink out of shot glasses just to get pissed rather than to actually experience the alcohol. I really can't tell you which I honestly find more annoying. So where are we then? We've tried a very large glass and we've tried a very small glass, and we've said that both of them are pretty awful. So if large glasses and small glasses are both bad, what's good and what's the difference and what does it all mean? I think to get any further, you've really got to look at the science of what a properly sized and shaped whiskey glass does and what's actually happening. And there's 4 things that are really important in any whiskey glass. So the first one is the air contact area. So that's going to be based on the height that you're supposed to fill the glass to. So the height around the 1 to 2 single measure limit, so somewhere around here, that area of whiskey that's exposed to air wants to be as large as you need it to be to make sure that all of those volatile compounds and aromas are evaporating out of the whiskey. If you have a glass that's very narrow at the point where the whiskey actually meets the air, you're going to have a small air to whiskey contact area and you're not going to get that aroma evaporating off. The second really important thing with a whiskey glass is the actual nosing area. So the area or the diameter at the top of the glass where it's actually open to the air, you don't want that to be too wide. If it's too wide, like in the pint glass, you're going to get all of those lovely aromas go straight out of the glass because there's just so much of a gap at the top that they're just not contained by the glass. So preferably, and probably always, you would want this air contact area, this part here, to be wider than the actual gap that allows the aromas out. Now, third thing that's really important with a whiskey glass is the actual depth. So again, with the whiskey glass, because it's so tall that any sensible measure of whiskey sits right at the bottom, anything that is evaporating off the whiskey is such a long way away from where you're going to be nosing it that it's going to take forever to get any sizable amount of aromas anywhere near where you're nosing. And what's worse than that, if you've got such a huge volume, any aromas that do get to the top, they're probably going to be escaping from the glass before you can actually get to nose them. Whereas with a sensibly sized and shaped whiskey glass, you've got a reasonably large chamber to contain those aromas, but it's reasonably enclosed and reasonably close enough to your nose that you're actually getting them rather than allowing them to escape. Now, the fourth thing that I think is really important about any whiskey glass is the method of heat transfer. So with any glass, I'm sure that we've all experienced, if you have a lovely pint glass of cold beer or soft drink, if you sit there for too long and hold it, the heat from your hand goes through the thin glass. Glass is a pretty good insulator, but by no means perfect. And all of that heat from your hand goes into your drink and makes it warm. Now, with a whiskey glass, that, in my opinion, can be a good thing or a bad thing, because you want your whiskey to be around room temperature. I prefer mine to be a little bit above room temperature, which is why you'll often see me when I'm using these glasses. I'll have either 1 or 2 fingers rested on the glass, because I find that it just adds a little bit of warmth to the whiskey, gets it evaporating a little bit quicker, gets more aromas out of there so you can really nose it. But on the other hand, you don't want to have to be forced to hold your whiskey and put too much heat into it, and that's where having a glass with a stem can really help, because if you've got a stem, you can either hold it by the stem or you can hold it by the base, and then you're putting the minimum amount of heat into your whiskey as you choose to. So in my opinion, when it comes to controlling how much heat goes into your whiskey, I'd say thin glass definitely helps, and a stem allows you to control whether you put that heat in or not. So now we know what we're looking for, let's move on to some of our other glasses and see if they're likely to be any good. So, hands up out there, who drinks their whiskey out of one of these? Probably no one at all, I would guess. So this is a small cocktail glass. So this is the sort of thing that you'd get a lot of fancy mixed drinks in. Maybe baby sham, some people might put wine in this, mojito, cosmopolitan, margarita, something like that. So if we're applying our science to this, we've got a stem, so that's brilliant. So apart from looking good, you can hold that by the stem, and my hand is almost not making any contact at all to the part that's holding the whiskey. So let's tip our single measure into this cocktail glass. Again, that's quite surprising, that tipping that single measure of whiskey in there, that actually nearly half fills that glass. So again, the geometry of the glass playing mind tricks on you there. Just goes to show that when you pour into a glass that you're not familiar with, you haven't always got any idea how much you've actually put in that glass, so you need to be careful. So with our single measure in the cocktail glass, let's nose it and see what we've got this time. So I would say this is probably reasonably similar to the shot glass, because I think it might be a little bit better because you've got a very large contact area with the air, so you've got a large potential for all of the flavour and all of the aroma to escape out of the whiskey and evaporate up. But because the glass is completely wide open at the top, you're losing almost all of that. You can imagine if you could see all of the evaporation coming out of this glass, it would just be pouring out in every direction. So while I can definitely smell that, and I think if I was smelling that blind I'd probably still identify it as Speyside whiskey, you're not getting as much as you could. So you have to think about these things. The average cocktail glass or martini glass, or even worse, the sort of glasses that they have with a bulge at the bottom and then this sort of shape at the top that they serve margaritas in. With the margarita glass, by having that bulge, so you've got quite a small air to liquid contact and having a large open dispersing shape at the top, you have to think that a margarita glass is designed almost perfectly to get any aroma and get rid of it as quickly as possible. So that really makes you question what the motives are for the people that first start to put margaritas into a margarita glass. It's definitely not to get the customer to taste what you're giving them. So moving on, what else have we got? This is one that everyone's going to be familiar with, the whiskey tumbler, also known as the rocks glass, because it's primarily designed for people to consume whiskey out of with ice. So let's get our horrible cocktail glass here and tip it into the tumbler. So instantly, going from this glass to this glass, aside from how it tastes or noses or anything like that, I immediately feel much more macho. Because it must be said that the whiskey tumbler, it's just such an easy meme that they use in fiction, TV and films. When you want to make a character look manly and macho, you put a whiskey in their hand and you put it in a whiskey tumbler with plenty of ice, and they sit there in a leather armchair in a darkened room, swirling their whiskey and puffing on a cigar. And it's just an easy way to convey that this is a man's man that means business. So is this man's man macho glass any good for drinking whiskey? So even without the ice, and I've said before, the ice cools the whiskey quite aggressively and dulls the aroma and the flavour that you're getting out of the whiskey. So ice is basically anti-flavour when it comes to drinking Scotch. But even without the ice in this glass, it's already subduing the aromas that I'm getting. I'm getting less aromas out of this than the cocktail glass, believe it or not. And I'd say that it's probably similar to the half pint glass. If you look at them, there's actually probably a good reason for that, because they're almost exactly the same shape. They've both got perfectly straight sides, they're about the same height, and they're about the same width. So whereas a few minutes ago we were saying how ridiculous it is to have whiskey in a half pint glass, turns out that a tumbler is actually basically the same thing. And I'd say that the amount of aroma that I'm getting out of this glass is probably similar to what I'm getting out of the half pint glass. For those of you out there who say, yeah, that's all very well, but I want ice in my whiskey, that's fair enough. If you like ice in your Scotch, by all means go for it. I'm not going to tell you how you can and should enjoy your whiskey if that's what you're into. But I will say that if you are someone that likes your whiskey chilled, perhaps you live in a hot country or that's just how you like it, I would really recommend trying to put the bottle of Scotch in the freezer. Now, if you put a bottle of 40% plus alcohol in the freezer, as long as the bottle is intact when it goes in, you're not going to have any problems. The whiskey's not going to freeze, because the freezing point of 40% alcohol is much, much lower than you'll get in a household freezer. The bottle's not going to crack, but when you take it out of the freezer, your whiskey's going to be ice cold, but without the drawbacks of the dilution that the ice adds. And also, by making your whiskey cold rather than adding cold ice to it, you can then put the cold whiskey in whatever glass you want. Just a thought. So the whiskey tumbler, not a great one for nosing or tasting whiskey. Probably should mention at this point one glass that I haven't got, and that's the Norland glass. Now, the Norland glass is a very well engineered and quite popular glass when you look at whiskey YouTubers, especially when you look at whiskey tubers when they're posting their fancy photos on Instagram. But the Norland glass is actually like a cross between a whiskey tumbler and a thermos flask, because it's probably a bit smaller than a proper whiskey tumbler, but it actually has an air gap in the middle. It's got an inner and outer layer of glass with an air gap in the middle, so that you can hold your Norland glass and your hand and the temperature from your hands not transferring over into the whiskey. Now, that is a very well engineered and effective solution to not heating your whiskey, but in my opinion, I live in a 130-year-old house in England, and it's not always that warm here. And in my opinion, whiskey can be too cold for drinking because it really does dull the aromas that you get from it. So to me, the Norland glass only solves the heat transfer problem one way. It prevents you from heating your whiskey up too much, but it gives you no way of heating your whiskey up easily. And that's why, me personally, I think a thin glass whiskey glass with a stem gives you the most flexibility, and it's the most effective solution to the heat transfer problem. That and the fact that Norland glasses, if you have a look online, they are insanely expensive. You can get a set of tulip style glasses or Glencairns, or probably even 2 or 3 tumblers for the same price as one Norland glass. So for that reason, it's probably not for me. So moving up the list of more sensible whiskey glasses, because to be honest, in my opinion, a tumbler is not really a sensible whiskey glass for anyone that wants to critically taste whiskey. The next best thing up would probably be something like a brandy snifter. Now, this is actually a glass I don't own, but they are roughly the same shape as this, just a bit larger. So a brandy snifter is the sort of thing that is traditionally used for enjoying brandy. And the idea is that you've got a large bowl at the bottom, so you can get quite a bit of brandy in there, and you've got a large air contact to get lots of aroma, and it's reasonably closed at the top. But it's basically just a larger, especially wider version of this sort of common whiskey glass that you're probably familiar with. So, in my opinion, if you are at a pub or a bar, especially one that serves really good whiskey, and you want to get the most out of something, if they say they haven't got a whiskey glass, but you can see that they have got brandy snifters behind the bar, that's probably not a bad second choice. And failing that, you might actually find that if they haven't got anything else, a red wine glass that's as closed and tulip-shaped at the top as possible might be a best third option. So brandy glasses are a good last resort, but could be a bit smaller, probably a little bit on the large side for what we want for tasting whiskey. And that really brings us to our next glass, which is something else that probably everyone's familiar with. That's the Glencairn. So this is one that everyone's seen, everyone's probably got one of. And if you go to pretty much any distillery or whiskey shop that actually gives you glasses to taste out of, you've probably been given something along the lines of this. So again, same large area for evaporating the aromas, small to focus it up to your nose, sensible height away from your nose so you're not losing all of those flavours inside the glass. There's no stem on your standard Glencairn, but they have got a large piece of glass. So this lump of glass at the bottom is going to have a high thermal mass, so it's going to take a while for this to heat up. So if you hold it by the bottom, as you see some YouTubers do, you're not going to add too much heat to your whiskey. Another good thing about Glencairns is it's also got a nice heft to it, because you've got that lump of glass. It almost feels as hefty and macho in the hand as a tumbler, but it's a much better glass for the experience of tasting whiskey. And that's why a lot of people will tell you that the Glencairn is really the gold standard of whiskey glasses. And that leads us on to my final pick. And there's two really, it's two final picks. So this, the tulip glass, places sell these by different names. A lot of places just call it a whiskey glass. Some places call it a capita. When it's called a capita, often has a lid that comes with it. But the difference between these and a Glencairn is that you have a narrow stem on the bottom. So I feel this really gives you the best of all worlds, because you've really got the ability to add heat into the whiskey or not, as you choose to. They are quite a bit more lightweight than the average Glencairn, and one thing that you do have to be careful about with most capitas and whiskey snifters and these glasses that are found, they do tend to be very thin, which means that you can get a lot of heat into the whiskey, but also when you're washing these up, especially if you're doing it by hand, it's very easy to break these as you're trying to clean inside them. And I've actually got a scar on one of my fingers somewhere where I was cleaning one of these and the whole thing just shattered. And because they're so thin, they break so easily and they will cut you like a knife. But me personally, apart from the added danger factor, I think that these are the best whiskey glasses. You've just got the perfect geometry, perfect size, perfect stem. They're reasonably affordable. On the subject of capitas that come with lids, you can buy things like this separately, which is something that I really like, because these ones with the lids, they tend to be that bit more pricey, and these lids tend to be a little bit on the fragile side. You can easily drop these and smash them, knock them off the top or anything like that. It does also make the glasses a little bit top heavy. So what you can do, which is usually a little bit more economical, you can buy these, which are often described as watch glasses, although you can use pretty much anything that's not going to add any aromas or taint the flavour of your whiskey, and just put those on the top just to keep the aromas in, to build up the aromas with a whiskey that's a bit shy, or just to not have the aromas escape until you're ready to drink it. Now, saying that, these glasses here are definitely my first choice for drinking whiskey. It's probably important to mention things like this. Now, this is actually a whiskey glass that I got from Bruichladdich when I was there in 2014. I did the tour, and this is what they give you at Bruichladdich distillery, or at least it was back then, to try their whiskies. And when I first got there, I thought, that's absolutely bonkers. Why aren't they giving you what every other Islay distillery back then did, which is something incredibly similar to this, or possibly with a longer stem? They were all using things like this, but Bruichladdich gave you these huge tumblers. And there's some people that say that this is the best way to drink whiskey. And I'm not going to say that they're wrong, because a glass like this, it does give you an incredibly different experience to a whiskey snifter or capita, or even a Glencairn. Because a glass like this, it's giving you a large area for the whiskey to evaporate. It's got a slight tulip shape, so it is focusing the aroma slightly, but it's still allowing quite a lot of the aroma to escape. So whiskey in a glass like this, you can understand that some people might prefer this. Perhaps, I imagine with whiskey, if it's a particularly young and fierce cask strength whiskey maybe, especially if it's something that doesn't take water too well, so you don't want to knock the ABV down, but the nose is a little bit too aggressive. So that's 40% Tamnavulin in there, but you can imagine if it's that little bit prickly and too much on the nose, that a glass shaped like this might be a suitable alternative to adding water and brewing the whiskey, to just tone it down that little bit. So you're getting the full experience on the palate, but you're just toning down the nose slightly. I'd say that anyone that thinks that these are the best glasses to drink whiskey out of, I'm not going to disagree with you, but I would say that it's important to do your experiments and experience different things, as I have here, and to make sure that whatever decisions you make are informed decisions and you know why you like what you like. So at the start of this video I promised you that I was going to tell you what the best value purchase that you could make in the world of whiskey was. And is it this? Is it this? It's this. This here is a simple little measure, the sort of thing that they sell in cookery aisles in probably several shops that are very close to your home, waiting to be bought right now. And I think that this is the best thing that you can buy in glassware, because buying this, you've got milliliter graduations on the side, or fluid ounces or teaspoons, or whatever bizarre measure that you might choose to use rather than millimeters for anyone that's not in Europe. But using one of these with a little bit of maths, you can easily dilute any whiskey that you've got from whatever ABV it is to whatever ABV you want. And that's what makes this the essential best value purchase that you can make in the world of whiskey. Probably that and a few of these for whatever glass you decide to use. Seriously though, best whiskey glasses for me is going to be stemmed Capita Snifter. So anyone out there that agrees or disagrees, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And anyone that agrees or disagrees, that's absolutely fine as long as you understand why. So thanks for watching. Cheers.